Our next speaker is Professor David Perlmutter from Texas Tech. Welcome.
I'm going to engage in a little conceit, and I teach political communication, so I always tell my students you have to be very aware of the audience you're speaking to, but I'm going to pretend partly that I'm speaking to a member of an important audience for this discussion that's not here today, and that is the President of Turkey. So I'm going to pretend that I was given 15 minutes to speak to him. And I'd like to talk to him, Your Excellency, about what I think are the personal, the individual, and also the global costs of the persecution of the Hizmet movement. Now, as I said, I study political communication, and so it's very important to me to sit back and try to be objective about looking at causes and effects of political communication in terms of what audiences think, what people think. When I go in front of a large room of students, I'll do a little pop quiz about the opinion of Turkey or the opinion of Islam. And it's very interesting. You ask a room of 300 students from, mostly non-Turkish, mostly non-Muslim, name one large international Muslim political organization or one national civil or civic organization. The number one that you will hear is ISIS. When you're talking with people who, that's all they read is the news. What's number two? Hizmet. What does that say about what we know, what's going on in the world? Now, I want to start with the President with a little personal story, and I apologize, I'm going to start out just with myself here. I was a professor at University of Kansas. This is about 2007, and I was approached by a group of Turkish students. They were PhDs in engineering and physics, and they invited me to a dialogue dinner that was associated with a group called the Hizmet movement, which I'd heard nothing of dialogue dinners or Hizmet movement at that time. And I have to admit that I was a little, uncertain. Who were these people? What was their agenda? And I have to admit, part of it is my own personal background. My father is Jewish. I'm Jewish. My mother, Greek Christian. Now, in terms of the Jews, very positive image, mostly, of Turkey. As you've heard some stories, the Turkish past, the acceptance of Jews. If you go to Istanbul and you go through all the security, you can visit the Jewish museum there in Istanbul, near the synagogue in Istanbul. You see wonderful exhibits about the history of the very close relationship between the Turks and the Jews. On the other hand, in my Greek part of my family, there's been a sort of unhappy 700-year relationship. And as on my mother's side, I'm the first male in about 250 years not to be in the Greek army. And as my mother pointed out once, not to physically kill a Turk in battle. Yet, I don't know what will happen in the future. But so I had a sort of mixed background to this. But then I started talking to these students, and they said something interesting to me that shocked me. And they showed, since I teach about visuals in politics, what they showed me visually shocked me. They told me that, as is true of many other universities, every year there was an International Student Day where, just like in the Olympics, students from different countries would march and carry the flag and maybe wear costumes from their country. And a few years before, for some reason or another, there had been no Greek students available, and so these Turkish students had volunteered to carry the Greek flag, and they showed me a picture of that. And I was really startled. For those of you who know about the relationship of Greeks and Turks, I guess that's like carrying the Michigan flag, Ohio State volunteering. And I said, I would love to send this picture to some of my Greek relatives, but since they would keel over with a heart attack, I'll hold on to it and just tell them orally. So I started learning about Hizmet, and since that time, I have met hundreds and hundreds of people in the Hizmet movement. Over and over, I have been struck by their beliefs are also their heart. This is not something they say because they're on camera. What they believe, which is the brotherhood and sisterhood of humanity across religion, across science, and across nationality, is what they actually believe, which for me is sort of strange because I'm so used to dealing with politics with people who say one thing and believe something else. As Reverend Cooper said earlier here, that going to Turkey itself was an eye-opener. And I've been on 2 trips. I went to one of the schools that I think is now under threat of being closed down. I took groups, by the way, of journalists and people within the media profession with me from Niagara Foundation, who sponsored the trips. We went to the school, and we were amazed, at the science education. And if you've ever visited his med school, you're just really impressed by the curriculum and start thinking, boy, my kids should be going here. But something else struck us was that there was a huge building that looked exactly like all of the beautiful mosques, the stone mosques you see in Turkey, and we expected it to be a mosque, and we walked inside. It turned out to be a science library. And the director of the school told me that actually the building had been the land and the building had been donated to become a mosque, but the school had said, you know what, we have enough mosques, we need a science library, so we want to turn this into a science library. And that had a lot of effect on me and the people on the trip. In fact, I think that's what I really want to point out on this individual, personal level, is how many people I brought to Turkey who were, relatively cosmopolitan, sophisticated people, journalists, people in the media profession, who came away with a lot of their stereotypes of Muslims and of Turks changed profoundly because of these introductions that Hizmet made. I remember particularly one that was moving to me was that we were invited, if you know on these trips, one of the most wonderful things, you get to go into people's homes and have lunch and dinner with the family and learn about them. We were at breakfast at a citrus farm. The father was the director of several Hizmet schools in, I believe, Madagascar. And I was sitting across a much older gentleman. I mean, he was obviously, a strong farmer, but he was much older, probably in his 90s. And he told me a very interesting story through the translation of his great-grandson, that he had been a Turk, a Muslim Turk living in Crete. And as you know, in the war in 1921 that my grandfather fought on the Greek side and invaded what was called occupied Greece, but other people called Turkey, and fought in the war with the Turks, there had been a peace treaty at the end of the war which included a massive population transfer, which meant a lot of Greek Christians being expelled from Anatolia, a lot of Turkish Muslims being expelled from Europe, and especially from Crete. So his family had been Muslim Turks that had been living in Crete for hundreds of years who were expelled. But then the coda of the story is he told me today he owns 2 businesses in Crete with Greek partners. And he made the statement to me again through his grandson, between peoples, no problems, between governments, always problems. I thought it was a profound bit of political philosophy. I'd like to quote him on there. So I want to point out, Mr. President, that this is the cost, that Hizmet has worked so hard to create these personal linkages for thousands and thousands of people. The year I went last to Turkey in 2012, I was told that there were 320 Hizmet trips from the United States. The incalculable goodness between individuals that in each one of them is blossoming for more relationships. And I don't know anybody who has gone on one of these trips who hasn't then followed up and tried to build more and more personal relationships. The cost of losing that for Turkey and for Islam and for world civilization are incalculable. Now on the global scale, I also want to point out, I probably shouldn't be quoting Marx to the president of Turkey, but Marx said, history repeats itself, first time as tragedy and then as farce. And I want to point out that I think a lot of the things the Turkish government has been doing now, if I may put it politely, are not well received and are not having the effect that probably you think that they're having on other audiences besides your cabinet, who are probably telling you, oh, yes, wonderful idea to everything that you say. And I also suspect planting in the minds of you, Mr. President, that we should always be looking out for these Hizmet people for what they're doing. First, the charge of terrorism. Probably some of you have heard the American ambassador who just recently left Turkey, and he talked about like every day the government of Turkey came to them with, the Hizmet people, they're obviously terrorists. And of course, our government would say, and the evidence is, well, we'll get back to you on that, we'll manufacture that. The fact is that no one in the Hizmet movement has ever committed an act of terrorism. No one associated with the Hizmet movement. No one has even committed an act of terrorism in the name of the Hizmet movement. I mean, think about how powerful somebody's message is. that nobody, even in the name of the movement, some crazy person on the side has committed an act of terrorism. That's unique in movements, by the way. No movement ever was able to have such a powerful message of peace that even crazy people on the side did not abuse that movement. So other things that come out, coming out with some of the statements that recently, for example, with the question of the Armenian genocide, which I won't go into, but when you have statements by the Turkish government and documentaries on Turkish television that calling the Armenian genocide is masterminded from Jerusalem, when Israel is one of the last countries that's holding out, I think incorrectly, in calling the Armenian massacre a genocide, it just makes your government look foolish. When you make these statements about terrorism, and when you make these statements about closing the schools, Mr. President, I remember meeting the minister of the government of Tanzania, who had 5 Hizmet schools, who told me personally, this is a conference by the Fountain that was organized in New York, he told me personally that they were the 5 best schools in the country. And so how can you send your ministers to go tell the government of Tanzania, as a personal favor, would you close the 5 best schools in your country? You have to understand that's not going to be well received. That would be like me coming to you and saying, would you mind closing these 5 mosques for me? Thank you, please. Not well received. So in conclusion, Mr. President, thank you very much for your time. I hope you get a chance to think about these things, because Hizmet is not as famous as ISIS. And perhaps it is because Hizmet, as several speakers alluded to earlier, is spending 95% of its time doing good and only 5% telling people how they're doing good, where a lot of other movements it's the other way around. But it's time for us who consider ourselves friends of Hizmet to maybe work harder to tell everyone, including the President of Turkey, about the good things that Hizmet is doing. And it's time for us to really calculate the costs of what a world would be without Hizmet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor David Perlmutter, for that wonderful presentation.